Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another live stream from Glasgow Loves EU. I'm Martin Roach. Our guest this evening is Professor Richard Whitman, who is a senior fellow on the UK in a Changing Europe initiative. He's an associate fellow at Chatham House, one of the most respected and well-established think tanks. He's a professor of politics and international relations at the Global Europe Centre at the University of Kent. And his current research interests include the foreign and security and defence policies of the UK and the EU. Richard, thank you very much for being with us tonight. Let me start with a topical question. China has been in the news over the weekend. We're not going to discuss the individuals, but really, I guess the question is, since Brexit, has the UK's position with China been strengthened because we're a nation free of what some people might see as the EU's constraints? Or has it made life more difficult in our relations with the Chinese because we are not part of the leverage that the EU might have? And has it made life more difficult for the EU?
Well, thanks very much, Martin. And I mean, that's a great question to kick off with, because in many ways, sort of foreign policy for a country is a bit like managing the weather. You know, you don't make it, but you have to respond to it. But to sort of flog the analogy to death, China is a bit like climate change. You know, it's having a major order impact on international relations as a rising power. And even where China was in 2016, you know, when the referendum took place and we started talking seriously about the consequences of Brexit, China was also in a different place. So it's quite difficult to sort of compare where we were with where we are. I think that's be the first thing that I'd say about China. But clearly, the issue for all states is how to respond to China, and is it done better through a larger organized arrangement such as the EU when it comes to trade policy in particular? Or are you able to cast a better deal and a better relationship with China operating individually? And I think the UK has been through a very interesting cycle. You know, it started off, you may remember, under David Cameron when he was Prime Minister, and even before the Brexit referendum, talking about the so-called golden era in the relationship between the UK and China, and that, you know, there's going to be a close relationship. And we've ended up going through a process in which, you know, China was a very difficult partner for the UK, particularly because of Hong Kong and what's happening in Hong Kong recently. But we've ended up now with, in a way, a real division within the Conservative Party between, you know, whether the UK should be more hawkish on China or whether the UK should see China still as a sort of economic opportunity. And that also tells us something else, that, you know, foreign policy can also be contested even within the same party. So that's a very long answer to your question, but I think obviously the jury's out for the UK in terms of what would have been the better position in terms of being within the EU or without. But the EU is having the same conversation with itself. So if you like, we're talking to ourselves in our political system about what to do, and the EU member states are talking in the same kind of terms with and between themselves, and we're both confronting the same problem. But I think at the moment, the EU is probably better placed on trade policy to do a better job with itself, but the UK is probably better placed on security, and that's something we can get into in due course, AUKUS and all that.
Right. Well, I mean, on the same theme as that, post-Brexit, the UK's foreign policy, I guess, has been described as global Britain. And you said a moment ago in terms of security, you thought the UK was in a better place with China. But what is how does UK foreign policy under this government stick together? Is it coherent? Does it have a central core, a central belief? That certainly when we were members of the EU, that's what it was. The central core was membership of the EU and of NATO. Where does it lie now?
Well, you know, that's where Brexit really was a significant moment, or it embarked, or the UK embarked on what is a major exercise unlike anything it's really experienced, I think, for a 50-year period. There were two major pillars to the UK's foreign policy. One was membership of NATO, and that obviously still endures, and the other being membership of the EU. And they really were absolutely central to the way the UK thought about its place in Europe and the way that it related to the United States. So ending the membership of the European Union, has led to a still unfinished conversation, I think, within Westminster and Whitehall as to what we use to replace those two pillars. And the initial answer that certainly Theresa May and her government had was this idea of global Britain, which was, I think, a slogan in search of content. And it's only really over the last couple of years, I think particularly from 2021, when we had something called the Integrated Review, which was a document that sort of set out a bit of prospectus for Britain's place in the world, that we started to get an answer as to what global Britain meant. And really at the core of it is that the UK is still a Euro-Atlantic power, as the government describes the country, but one that has tilted towards the Indo-Pacific as well. And that idea was supposed to encompass the fact that we couldn't change our geography or our geopolitics, if you prefer. We couldn't change our neighborhood, but, sort of power. And in many ways, the sort of cockpit of the future of international relations was going to be in the Indo-Pacific, because of China, the rise of China in particular. And so, we have an answer, if you like, to, what global Britain means, but whether you can pursue that policy in a way that the UK has meaningful influence, I think is a different question. And even more interestingly, I think, since Mr. Sunak became Prime Minister, that both he and James Cleverly, Foreign Secretary, and other members of the government have stopped using that description, have stopped talking about global Britain. So we've gone from, what we had for sort of 50 years, a kind of twin-pillared, bridge across the Atlantic type policy, through global Britain, and now we've reached post-global Britain without realizing that we've been sort of through and out the other side of global Britain. So, it's been a bit of a roller coaster, I think, in terms of how people in Westminster and Whitehall have tried to get a handle on what it really means to have removed ourselves from a sort of large and important European multilateral organization.
Might it suggest, given that the three great powers are all in turmoil, Russia, for obvious reasons, China's economic problems are, I think, deeper than a lot of people in Westminster recognise, and it's had to become more of a domestically driven economy. And there's clearly something happening in China. It may take some time to pan out, but there's something happening. There's some change happening there as well. And even a Biden victory in the US will still not cure America. There's going to be instability there for some time to come. So is it just that the force of circumstances globally might just drive us closer into European relationships than perhaps some people on the British right would like?
Well, of course, the UK is a great power. I'm sure we'd all agree on that. But it's not a great power in the same order of those states, and particularly China and the US, is it? And really, probably more realistic, we'd have to think about the UK as a middle power. And the problem for middle powers is that we really, if we think of ourselves in those terms, we generally have to, as so-called realist commentators would say about, the balance of power, you either sign up, to be a key ally with one of the lead powers, or you sort of balance against it. And that's, in many ways, for some, an encapsulation of the problem that all states have now, and in a moment in which there is a great deal of uncertainty about where the US might be at, who those of us in the West, which includes the UK and obviously the European Union, we're less certain about what the US stands for and whether the US is the partner that it was in the past, just at the moment in which we're seeing this sort of major systemic change with a rising power that is China. And we know the US is more interested in China and possibly less interested in us than was the case in the past. But how do we respond?
Yeah.
Do we sort of hug the US much closer, or do we make some kind of accommodation with China and try and pursue a middle ground? And until fairly recently, we weren't really asking ourselves hard questions about Russia, were we? In many ways, we sort of had a Russia, or an approach towards Russia, which was cross our fingers and hope, that Russia was sort of going to become a bit more like us, put it those terms. And it's obviously ended up in a somewhat different place and has a much closer relationship with China. So, it's fiendishly complicated in terms of the sort of systemic change, but particularly difficult for smaller states, less, or states who haven't got the position to sort of shape the system to have a meaningful role. And what do? Do you specialize in something? Do you ally? Do you want to be neutral? And the UK neutrality, if you like, or sitting back and deciding not to be engaged, hasn't been the UK way so far. Yeah, and it certainly hasn't been something that our political class and our securocrats have signed up for. So we've tended to align ourselves with the US. And so as the US interests change, we've generally adapted ourselves to those changes, sort of Cold War, post-Cold War, and now the rise of China.
But we're still going to be an Atlanticist, stroke European power. And so we still have to have cooperation with our European partners in that. Have our actions in following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, has that brought us closer to our defence relationships in Europe, as opposed to our foreign policy relationships, if you can split them? But are we friendly? Are we cooperative? Are the doors as open as they once might have been?
Well, probably the most important determinant of the UK's foreign policy, certainly over the last 500 years, has been what's happening on the continent. What are the powers, if you want to think in terms of states, or the ideas which are on the rise, and how the UK responds to those. And we're obviously more than aware that in the last century, on 2 occasions, the UK sort of fought wars to preserve a particular kind of order, balance of power, some would say, or to deal with the idea that one state might predominate on the continent. So it's something which has in many ways been determining of us as a nation, and been determining of us in the way that we think about our place in the world. And so the unusual thing, I think, if you think back, certainly over the last few hundred years, is to be so relatively disconnected from a major development on the continent, meaning outside the EU. Obviously, the UK is a member of NATO, but NATO has a fairly narrow prerogative as an organisation. But the European Union is a different undertaking. It's a major. It's a major part of how the continent is governed, and has a major bearing on how we define Europe and where the boundaries of Europe are being drawn. So, not to be a part of that is a major challenge, I think, for the UK. I'm putting that sort of classic British understatement there. And in many ways, I think the UK is in a sort of tricky situation if we sort of abstract ourselves from, the sort of politics of whether we, should rejoin the EU and so on. It's, the UK is in what I sort of call a Goldilocks position. We sort of want the EU to not be too successful because it makes our life more difficult, but we also don't want it to be too unsuccessful because that would also make our life very difficult. Yeah. So we want it to be in a place in which you could have a good collaborative relationship, that it's a sort of partnership to mutual benefit. but a partnership in which the UK would see that that there is still some sort of scope, to pursue a kind of independent European policy, and also to have some influence, particularly through individual state capitals. But I think what's really changed the calculation here and on the continent is obviously Russia's war on Ukraine, where the UK has, I think, to a certain degree, moved off the naughty step as a European state because of its response to Ukraine. But it's also sort of reminded, I think, people here that Europe is the sort of the cockpit of our security and defence. Yeah. And if we don't get that right and don't get the relationship right with our neighbours and with our neighbourhood, then we don't have the luxury of not being impacted by that. We're not the United States, where we have a very large ocean between us, and we're able to pursue a policy independent of developments within our neighbourhood. And that means, sorry, I was just going to say, that means we're sort of doomed to cooperate. But the real issue is, for me, is the on what we cooperate and how we manage that cooperation.
Well, that I would imagine inform the next question. I mean, if we get a Labour government at Westminster, it inherits all of those issues. Is there very much that Labour can, or is there very much Labour wants to do differently in your estimation?
Well, I mean, to me, I think where we're at with the EU, some member state governments are a bit different, but where we are with the EU is we're in a period of détente. And if you think about the Cold War, and that's probably where most people would be familiar with the idea of détente, essentially it was a period in which the superpowers found a way of managing their difficult relationship. They weren't reconciled to one another in terms of, the political and economic projects that either side was pursuing. They obviously still prepared for war against the other. Thankfully, the UK hasn't doing that with the EU. But it was about finding a way of living with a partner and the means to do that without necessarily solving the underlying differences, but finding mechanisms by which you could work together. And I think all of the things that have happened recently, and certainly since we changed Boris Johnson as our Prime Minister, have got us more in that territory, I think. But that's not the same thing as a normal relationship, I would say. And it's certainly not the same thing as a relationship which, even in the terms in which we have a formal agreement with the EU, is being sort of fully utilised.
And if David Lammy is the Foreign Secretary the morning after, where does he go first?
That's an interesting question, isn't it? Where is the first overseas visit? I mean, that's always supposed to be symbolic, isn't it? Do you go to, well, for British Prime Ministers, of course, they're always neurotic about the United States. Yeah. And so they're absolutely desperate to get, be the first country to get an invitation from the US when you get a new US president. But the other way around, where to go in Europe first is a really interesting question, I think, because, one of the complicating things, I think, for an incoming Labour government, apart from the relationship with the EU, is the relationship with major states in Europe, that France and Germany in particular. The UK has a very complicated and, I think, tentative and difficult relationship with both capitals for different reasons at the moment. And would the easiest thing be to go to Brussels? Perhaps. I suspect that the ideal, if I was sort of on the EU side, making recommendations about how to respond to a new British government, was be to extend an invitation to the British Prime Minister to join a European Council meeting, the meeting of heads of state and government, as a sort of powerful piece of symbolism that there is a desire to rework the relationship. And obviously, if a foreign secretary normally prepares the ground for that, so maybe it's Brussels is where he has to go.
He has to go
first.
Well, one of the consequences of the war in Ukraine, of course, was the energy crisis, which hit the Europeans. And I have to say, I find it impressive the way they've responded to that and the mechanisms they've put in place. And it's been called something of a geopolitical awakening for the Europeans. So there's something of a new dynamic at work. Has the institution been strengthened by that experience? Perhaps even by the experience of Brexit in some respects. And if it has, have the voters recognised that? Do people in Europe see a slightly different patina to the institution?
Well, a lot of sort of European commentators talk about the sort of polycrisis. We've had almost from the Eurozone crisis through Brexit, through COVID, and now through Ukraine. The European Union's almost as a sort of way of operating, has sort of had to deal with recurrent crises and found ways to manage those. And you could say that certainly when you think about Brexit, when you think about COVID, and I think now Ukraine, I think it's strengthened the EU as a political project. And I think it's strengthened the rationale for the form of cooperation that the EU represents, where problems are too big to be solved by an individual country within its own resources. Whether that translates into a sort of public sentiment that has a sort of a positive view of the EU is more complicated. I mean, certainly polling suggests that is the case, and certainly I think Brexit was probably the most important of all of those exercises, because the way the British government handled it in terms of increasing or seeing a rebound in enthusiasm for European integration. But I think the interesting thing about the EU that I'm sure we'll see come out in the European Parliament elections, which we've got coming up next year, is that those are becoming more like domestic politics. In the sense that the issues that are being contested and the lineup of the parties now is more about a platform that looks and feels like a general election, even if the personality is not known as well, and perhaps the manifestos are not as familiar with a sort of national electorate as they would be for a European electorate. But I mean, essentially, the issues are around how much the state intervenes, how much it should spend, and the different ways in which it should secure us. The really major transformation, I think, though, under the current commission and the current sort of cycle of leadership we're in, as you said, is this sort of geopolitical awakening. I mean, some of the things that the EU's done on the defence side, as well as on the energy security side, and the way that it's handled those who have been forced into refugee status from Ukraine, have been pretty extraordinary. And almost sort of one taboo after another has fallen when it comes to what the member states are doing collectively to support Ukraine, which raises a different set of issues about what the EU stands for internationally, where it was essentially a peace project, and now it's becoming something which is not, frankly, as it develops more of a military and security and defence dimension, which is a different kind of political problem, but is a major transformation from where the EU was, even 2 or 3 years ago.
Thank you. I'm just going to interrupt a second and let Dee has a question, I think.
Yeah, Richard, I'm just going to ask, because obviously you're a professor in a university, about your young people, and because I'm very concerned about how young people are thinking about this whole thing. A lot of them, particularly the students you got coming up, couldn't even vote in the Brexit referendum, and how they feel about it, and when they're having their tutorials and things and writing their essays and stuff with you, what's their sort of feeling? Do they feel like they've been sold out by the way the vote went, but also with the big move. I mean, everywhere, every program you listen to, I listen to Any Questions all the time, and every week, everything, when there's something against Brexit, people are just really cheering to the rooftops, and people are really feeling that it was, it needs to be a bit more than détente, perhaps.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we all know, don't we? In the polling where we are at the moment, in terms of public sentiment, irrespective of age. Interestingly, I think how people are viewing Brexit as a project, and again, we've got the complexity in terms of different voter self-identification, and still obviously conservative identifying voters tend to lean in a slightly different way from Labour voters, and if you do get a Labour government, then obviously I think that has implications for the way that Labour handles the issue, or how it feels it's got freedom to handle the relationship with the EU. I mean, I think what's extraordinary, when you think back, and I was thinking about this today, back to 2016, and the number of people who have joined the electoral roll since 2016, the number of people who have passed through a transforming higher education system. I mean, you take my own institution, we used to have 30, certainly the courses I was involved in, at least 30% of our students were from the continent. They're not now. Yeah. So that's a very different student body from what we had previously. And for the students in terms of, employment opportunities and where they might end up, that's obviously, there's a different set of, there's different circumstances from, choices perhaps that were available to students before 2019, certainly. Mm-hmm. It's more difficult to see how that may convert into where we are in a general election, of course, because, at the moment, we face a choice in terms of what the parties are offering. Certainly the parties which are likely to predominate in England were from a very curious, careful and quite nuanced position that Labour's adopted. A Liberal Democrat position which is obviously ostensibly more ambitious, if you like, than the Labour position in terms of its offering, but doesn't appear to be benefiting the party in the polls, and the Conservative Party, which is in a place in which its prospectus is going to be interesting to see, because it's difficult to see what the offering would be. I mean, my only other thought on this, and my apologies, it's been a sort of rambling answer because I haven't quite got it clear in my own mind, where young people might end up in all of this, particularly voting, is we know they tend to vote in smaller numbers than the elderly do, and we know that the older you are, there is still a greater predisposition to think about Brexit in a different way from the young.
Well, and accepting all of us, of course.
Yeah. I mean,
and many others like us too. So yeah. I hate those cliches personally, being an older person.
But in terms of what we know about polling, it's
polling,
I mean, is obviously a fairly rough science, but but that's what polling tells us. But everybody's shifting. But the major problem still, or I thought will still be the turnout for the younger electorate. Which is,
it doesn't help that they can't use their student IDs, but we can use our bus passes. That's really stupid.
Yeah, well, that's another issue, isn't it? Yeah. Voter suppression and all that. As to whether that's
anyway. I'm completely off the point there. But I just
Richard, I wanted you in the last 5 or 6 minutes that we've got to put you as an Englishman 500 miles away, deep in the southeast of England, on the spot and talk a bit about Scottish politics, from an international and a European perspective, of course. I mean, the SNP is making a great deal of the fact that it's the only significantly major party in Scotland with an unequivocal position on Europe. We're seeing it being wound up with the Rutherglen by-election, which is only a mile or two from where I am now. Scotland clearly, no, Scotland has friends in Europe, but the idea of Scotland in Europe has some friends in Europe. Does there anybody bothered in Europe? Is there anybody listening? Is there anybody even prepared to say things even in a coded way that might give the SNP some comfort that if they were to persuade the Scottish electorate to have a second referendum and then subsequently vote for independence, that there would be an easy or easier passage back into membership?
I'll offer sort of a two-part answer. One will be sort of, I feel on slightly safer ground, and then I'll chance my arm, if that's okay. I mean, the safer ground bit is the EU's debate on enlargement is been changed dramatically by Ukraine. That now the questions within sort of Brussels, so-called Brussels Beltway, is how do you make enlargement work? And that's beneficial to any nation state that wants to seek membership of the EU, because we've suffered from a process where the EU basically hasn't been in the enlargement business in recent years and hasn't thought creatively, and there hasn't been the political dynamism for enlargement. I think wherever a nation state is now a completely different context for how a state might fit. So there's that sort of general, if you like, sort of the political environment is different, irrespective of where you sit and what your background is and where you come to the position of seeking membership of the EU. That's a major change, not to be underestimated, I think, in terms of the politics of the possible, actually. And but the second issue is obviously where we might end up in terms of Scottish independence in particular, and how you make the relationship work between the constituent nations that are currently part of the UK, if one of them or more than one, seeks to pursue an independence project, and how the EU would think about that. I think the short answer is the EU, there was quite a lot of interest and thinking around Scotland's place within the EU after 2016, particularly, seeing that difference in terms of where the Scottish public relate. My sense now is that it's not something that is on people's radar as much as it was previously, partly because, Brexit has just made the whole of the United Kingdom, Great Britain, Northern Ireland look like a massive pain in the neck, frankly. And you've got your own, I think the view would be, you're basically, you've had a whole series of political issues that we can't help to solve. You've got to sort them out yourselves and then come back to us when you're in a position in which, we can have a reasonable relationship. Because of course the key for the EU, and this holds as much for a sort of Labour government coming in power as it does for what the SNP's political project is, that you have to persuade people in Brussels, in national capitals, that whatever position is being set out is one that's going to endure. That we're not going to flip-flop, whoever that might be, whether it's Scotland probably wouldn't, but, the UK in general, to swing between these extremes of, we want to rejoin, in a different place whenever the government changes. It's a long-term political and economic project to be a member. And as we've discovered, unwinding that is fiendishly complicated. So persuading others to take any part of this collection of islands into the EU, I think is the sort of political stability, or persuading that there is a political stability that's not going to give more problems for the EU, is going to be absolutely crucial. And we could sort of rehearse all the arguments why Scotland could make it work. And I have no doubt that there's a formula that could be used to make an independent Scotland, a member of the European Union. I don't doubt that. But I think there's a sort of broader project of persuasion about the sort of stability, if you like, of whatever relationship is reached between the constituent nations here and whatever political order we've got. That frankly, looking from the outside, we haven't been able to persuade third parties that we've got that at the moment. And and that to me really is probably the most important thing to be overcome, frankly. Whether it's Scotland seeking membership, or a UK seeking membership, or a UK minus Scotland, seeking to rejoin the EU. I think that's certainly what I would be, asking of the UK, or asking myself when I was contemplating, the UK as a member. I think technically the burdens of membership could be taken on, but I think this job of persuading that we are sort of stable, if you like, politically, and the public stands behind that, and the public wants to see that, because obviously, we demonstrated in the last referendum that we had a far more complicated lineup in terms of public opinion than probably most of us thought was the case before the referendum.
Mm-hmm. So a final question, really, which is still on Scotland, but is very much about all the issues that we've talked about tonight. One of the things that the SNP has often seen as a barrier for them achieving their ambition has been the ambiguity about Scotland's position in NATO, that ridding Scottish territory of Trident and other nuclear weapon system, a fundamental policy of the SNP. Probably much more important to the membership, to be honest, than to the leadership, I sometimes think. But nonetheless, that's the stated position, and it's always been, the SNP have always seen that as a difficulty in persuading, particularly Scotland's middle classes, of the value of independence. But Ukraine has changed everything. And we've got the Swedes, another non-nuclear nation, about to, very close now, I think, to NATO membership. Is that a precedent? If the Swedes come in and Scotland went to a second referendum in independence, would it be a reasonable proposition to say that Scotland would, all things being equal, be likely to be admitted as a NATO member?
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing is, NATO hasn't stood still, and this is the really interesting thing, because NATO was putting itself in a different place in terms of, although the nuclear aspect was there, NATO as a body founded upon deterrence, NATO had drifted away from a bit, because of the security environment in Europe. That's now very much back front and center. Yeah. And I think what we're already seeing is that some governments which were reluctant to renew aircraft, for example, that were nuclear capable, could carry nuclear munitions, and now finding themselves in a place in which they're going to have to take decisions to carry them. Of course, the major nuclear weapons possessing states within NATO and who have committed their weapons to NATO are the UK and the US, and France is in a different place. Yeah. But I think the nuclear issue is back, if you like, with a vengeance, I think, within NATO. And I think any country that had an upfront difficulty with the idea of being part of an alliance that's going to lean quite heavily on nuclear weapons would have a bit more of a difficulty. I think the Swedish and Finnish position on NATO membership and on the nuclear question has been obviously to accept all the burdens, if you like, or all the responsibilities of being a NATO member, but not having an extended public navel gazing about the nuclear aspect.
And does that include, Richard, getting towards the minimum spend on defence?
I mean, I think spending is not a problem now. I mean, if you look at most NATO member states, they don't have to be persuaded that they've got to spend more on defence. Whether they'll spend it wisely is another matter. I mean, this is it's a whole other business, and not least because there aren't that many people who are in a position to sort of soak up that defence spending quite quickly, in terms of people who produce stuff. But I mean, that to me is a debate that's won, and nobody has to be persuaded to spend more on defence. As I say, the nuclear question is more difficult, but also NATO itself, has changed quite profoundly by those enlargements that you mentioned. It's now much more of a Northern European organisation in terms of states. I think they're going to be far more significant. So if you think about the geography there, whether within or without the United Kingdom, Scotland is pretty integral to the North Atlantic
to Nordic powers.
Yeah, exactly. So that's where the interesting questions are for me on the other side also, how NATO would cope with a Scotland that wasn't within NATO. So I think that's where the deal is to be done, that Scotland is important for NATO. It's obviously important for the defence of the United Kingdom. And these issues around things like nuclear weapons possession and NATO's nuclear doctrine are things that are going to be possibly the most difficult aspects of this for, political activists who care a lot.
Yeah.
But as you said, Russia and Russia's actions have completely changed the discussion around how you can deter and what you have to talk about in terms of deterrence.
And it might stir up CND type of action, I guess, at some point as it deepens. We're just about the end of time. I'm just going to check with G if there's anything else has come in, and you've very kindly allowed us to run 10 minutes over the allotted time. Richard, first of all, can I say thanks to Dee and to Bernd, who looked after the technical side and the social media. Richard, that's been absolutely fascinating. There's been so many strands there. We could go on for a great deal more time, but I think you've given us a more coherent understanding of Brexit and its foreign policy implications than I've certainly heard for some time. And you've given us a lot of food for thought, and I'm sure that this live stream is going to be reviewed many times after that. So on behalf of everybody up here in Glasgow and everybody here in Scotland, thank you very much indeed for